As the world grapples with the many tangible impacts of decades of unchecked carbon emissions, heat stress in particular has become a significant issue for the elderly. The older we get, our vulnerability to persistent heat waves increases dramatically, making cooling of our urban environments a priority for planners everywhere. Tony Matthews is a senior lecturer in urban and environmental planning at Griffith University. Tony, thanks for joining us once again. Life expectancy is increasing in most countries. In Australia, for example, 1 in 4 citizens will be over 60 by the year 2050. As extended periods of increased heat look set to intensify, this is clearly an escalating concern.
Oh, absolutely, very much so. And thank you for having me along. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, escalating heat in cities and suburbs and the places where we all live is turning into a considerable concern in many countries, particularly when we start to take account of people with additional physiological needs or vulnerabilities. And a particular concern within that group is, of course, older people or seniors, which would be people over the age of 65. And so we not only have more people living in cities globally and are therefore prone to urban heat globally, but we also have an expanding cohort of seniors globally. So we have more older people living in cities who are now and into the future going to experience more heat and heat stress and heat related problems. And so that is emerging as a very large planning and public health concern.
So with that in mind, what measurable impact does extensively greening our cities have on all of this?
Huge. In fact, greening cities, particularly using trees, is one of the cheapest and most cost-effective and highest return ways of reducing urban heat. I mean, if you think, for example, just about a basic urban street, which will have traffic in the middle of it and then will be flanked on each side by pavements, if you can plant a row of street trees that shade those pavements could be 10, 15, maybe even 20 degrees cooler than the adjacent road because of the combined effect of the shading from the trees and also the transpiration from the tree's own leaves. So if you have people walking along that road, they're much more likely to walk in shade where the heat is comfortable than they would be if the trees were not otherwise there. And the same logic then flows on to things like pavement dining or cafes or anything like that. So the more greenery that you can use, the more you can naturally shade a place, the more that will then drive down temperature, which will facilitate people being outside and staying longer. So it's a really, really good way to do things.
Well, you mentioned, planting trees along the street, but what are some of the other simple things that can make a significant difference, knowing now that heat is only going to get worse?
Yeah, well, we've been looking at this. My research teams have been looking at this, and other research teams around the world have been looking at this, and we're tending to look at it across a range of different interventions, if you like. So there's sort of behavioural interventions, which is something as simple as just putting out public messaging that today, today between 12 and 3, it's not advisable to go outside if you've compromised immunity or something like that, or if you have cardiovascular problems. That's behavioural. And then there's technical interventions as well, which would be things like tree planting and so on and so forth. And then there's higher scale policy interventions. So what we are finding from the research and the practice is that the way that different cities are managing heat and the types of interventions that they're favouring and going for are very dependent on the environmental circumstances of that particular city itself, as well as the spatial form of the city and the demographic profile of the city. So a very hot city with a lot of very elderly people will be taking far more steps across way more domains than another city might be. So there are some basic steps that can be taken, but many cities are taking quite a bespoke approach to this, which is an interesting development.
Do you think there's enough cooperation and collaboration between government, planners, councils and the private sector to achieve the best urban outcomes for our age sector in particular?
I would say that what there is a strong willingness among the different stakeholders, public, private and community and others, to really start to look at these questions more carefully and also in a more coordinated way across those different fields. And so, yes, planning for the health and well-being of aging cohorts has implications for many people. I mean, obviously there's implications for governments, because governments, for example, are the ones that are paying to run healthcare systems and hospitals and things like that, but also it has implications for many private sector businesses as well. So the insurance industry and others would be involved in this. But then the community sector is very involved in this conversation also, because a lot of assistance to elderly people or in-home assistance or anything like that comes through the community and voluntary sector. And then you have other linkages with sectors like my own, the built environment, urban design, urban planning, architecture. So what's starting to happen is a realization that in order to accurately frame the issues that need to be responded to, and then in order to generate meaningful responses, a multi-stakeholder dialogue is required, and many countries and many cities are now starting to go that way. But I would say it's relatively recent, but growing quickly.
And what about aged care facilities? How much a plan is talking about green infrastructure solutions there?
Not enough, unfortunately. I feel like I might be one of the only few that is doing that. I've been doing a lot of research and consultancy work specifically looking at aged care facilities, because that's where a lot of elderly people live, and therefore that's where where they're most vulnerable to heat. I mean, any of us is most vulnerable to heat really in the place we spend the most time. So I have been and continue to look specifically at aged care. There's sort of two issues going on in aged care. There is a wide, let's say there's three really. There is quite a wide awareness in the industry that things like heat management and sustainability more generally, and linking the two together is desirable and something that aged care providers are keen to look at in their facilities. So that's one thing. That's good. There's a good attitude there. One issue that we come up against is a lot of existing aged care facilities are coming to the end of their viable lifespan. They don't last forever, and like any other buildings, they have to be replaced. So sometimes providers don't want to invest further in those facilities because they know they're going to be tearing them down and completely replacing them in a few years anyway. So there's a bit of an issue with trying to target legacy aged care facilities. And then the third and final issue, and this is not stopping green infrastructure in aged care, but it is a bit of something that needs to be navigated around, is because urban land is becoming such a premium. Aged care facilities, at least in Australia, but also across the Asia Pacific, are having to go up rather than out. So we're getting sort of high-rise aged care, whereas previously aged care tended to be done in a more campus-style development, with easier access to the outdoors and often garden spaces and green spaces. Once you start going high-rise or vertical aged care, it makes it much harder to integrate that green infrastructure. So whilst the will might be there, the technical challenges become more difficult, but the whole transition to high-rise is driven by market forces. So it's a complex one, but there's a definite recognition and desire to do something in the space for sure.